I want out! I want out now! You thought you were gonna get some playtime in the yard, boy? Is that what you thought this was gonna be?
I had no idea it would turn out this way.
In the late 2003, early 2004, over in Iraq, at a place called Abu Ghraib prison, run by American military personnel. Prisoners there were victims of the most horrendous physical, psychological and sexual torture and abuse ever been documented. The world was outraged. However, many people argued that it was just because of a bunch of uncivil prisoners. Many people, except from Philip Zimbardo, who've been through this before, and argues it's not the prisoners, it's the guards. Coming to this conclusion that good people could do bad things given the right situation and within the right system. In August of 1971, a man named Professor Philip Zimbardo began a scientific investigation into the power dynamics that exist between guards and inmates in a closed prison setting. As he later wrote in his book, The Lucifer Effect, Zimbardo wanted to know, if you put good people in a bad place, do the people triumph, or does the place corrupt them? The objective of the Stanford prison experiment was to determine if it was the purchase of power that made guards turn brutal, or whether brutality was actually intrinsic to human nature itself. The notorious experiment that assured would kick off decades of academic controversy that suggests some of very dark findings about the nature of humanity. So no further ado, we are going to be unfolding the Stanford prison experiment by your host, The Unknown Past. It all started with an ad Zimbardo placed in the classifieds. It read, "Male college students in need for psychological study of prison life experiment. $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks to participate." This will be $93 in current times after inflation. The paycheck was funded by the US Office of Naval Research, as they were interested in learning about hierarchies of power in military prisons. The objective would be to determine if those relationships were shaped more by the prison environment or the personalities of the guards. 70 plus people applied. Each person was interviewed and had to take a personality test. Everyone who had a criminal record or record of using narcotics was eliminated, as was everyone who displayed personality disorders, physical disabilities or psychological problems. After this, Zimbardo and some of his fellow members of the experiment selected 24 volunteers. Zimbardo and his assistants converted the basement of Stanford's psychology department building into a makeshift prison. Zimbardo had an ex-convict, so he could make the prison setting realistic as possible. After creating the fake prison, Zimbardo then flipped a coin to decide which test subjects would be guards and which would be prisoners, to avoid selective bias. There were 12 of each category, 9 that were active participants and 3 that were alternates. This was the first stage complete. Now the experiment can begin. Within a few days, Zimbardo assigned real-life cops to pretend to arrest the students playing prisoners at their homes. This was to make it more realistic. They blindfolded and even got the prisoners' fingerprints. They were later transferred into a fake prison. They were tossed into a holding cell with 3 inmates per cell. They also included a solitary confinement room, which was a closet before. After the real cops were gone, the participants with their guard roles came into place. They were given real-life prison uniforms, complete with nightsticks and whistles. They had mirrored sunglasses to prevent eye contact with the prisoners. Moreover, within a few hours, the prisoners were treated like animals, as they were stripped naked and forced to wear dress-like garments without underwear. But they were given nylon stockings as hats, and fitted with a chain locked around one ankle. The students playing guards were also encouraged to make their own rules, leading to 17 strict guidelines the prisoners were forced to live by. The prisoners were labelled and referred through numbers. They also referred other inmates by their numbers as well. It was certainly a recipe for dehumanization and oppression. Zimbardo himself served as a superintendent of the prison, and the researcher David Jaffe played as the warden. The two were responsible for instructing the guards and laying down the scope of their duties. First and foremost, the guards were told to maintain order. They were allowed to use short or physical violence if necessary. Things that were permitted including harassment, the withholding of food, and the deprivation of privileges of the guards' discretion. The guards, unlike the prisoners, were allowed to work in shifts. The shifts required 3 guards lasting 8 hours each shift, and the off-duty guards didn't have to tend during those hours, but they must be still available in case. During the middle of the night, the guards blew whistles and forced the prisoners to exercise outside their cells. Keep in mind, these inmates are not allowed to go outside. Instead, they were stationed inside for all time until the experiment ended. This later caused them to go insane as they lost count of time with other various of reasons. We will mention them as we proceed in the video. Once the prisoners finished exercising, they were ordered to call out their numbers and their inmates next to them. They were ordered to repeat the procedure many times. This made them extremely exhausted until some of the prisoners hit their breaking point and started to argue with the guards, leading to several hours in solitary confinement in the dark closet as punishment. After a few hours, they were let out and everyone had to remake their beds so they can sleep. The second day, the prisoners went on strike, removing the hats and the numbers of the uniforms. They started barricading the cell doors with their beds to keep the guards from entering. That's when things got even darker, as the guards on duty of the time called for reinforcements and used fire extinguishers to force the inmates away from the door. After forcing their way in, they removed the beds, making the prisoners sleep on the floor. Not only that, they prevented them from eating and brushing their teeth as punishment. However, one of the 3 cells didn't intervene in the rebellion, making them get privileges from the guards, such as beds, better food, and treatment, etc. It was only day 2 and things were getting ugly. After a few hours, the guards would randomly move prisoners around. The idea was to create confusion and distrust within the inmates. Also, the guards forbid the use of toilets for the inmates that were involved in the rebellion, and instead they used buckets. Soon the guards stopped emptying the buckets. This gave the place a horrible smell. The prisoner who created this rebellious act was prisoner 8612. His name is Douglas Colby. Less than 36 hours into the experiment, Douglas Colby began suffering from what was described as acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying and rage, because he was one of the ringleaders alongside prisoner 819 during the rebellion. Colby had been thrown into solitary confinement and was a target harassment from the guards. However, once prisoner 8612 began showing his erratic behavior, the researchers thought he was faking it at first until he attempted to escape, leading the discharge of prisoner 8612. But other prisoners didn't know he was discharged. Instead, they were informed that he was in another section of the building for bad behavior as punishment. Moreover, after the experiment, Douglas Colby stated, "The breakdown I had was a manipulation to get out of that damn experiment." However, a documentary made by Zimbardo, prisoner 8612, told a different story.
It was an experience of being out of control, both of the situation and of my feelings.
One guard in particular was noted for his sadistic tendencies. He was feared the most amongst the other prisoners. Even some of the other guards was afraid of him as well. His name is Dave Eshelman, but the prisoners called him John Wayne, due to the fact he molded himself after the villainous prison warden from Paul Newman movie Cool Man Luke. He even used a southern accent when speaking to the prisoners. Throughout the experiment, he said all sorts of terrible things. He once ordered 2 prisoners to act as Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein, forcing them to embrace while saying, "I love you." He even went to such an extent he forced several of the prisoners to simulate intercourse. No one stopped him, not even the other guards. According to John Wayne, he believes he's not at fault, as he was simply trying to expose the evils inherent in the prison type of experiment. As he told in Stanford magazine, "I set out with a defined plan in mind to try to force the action. to force something to happen so that the researchers would have something to work with. He also mentions that any blame lies on Zimbardo.
In the air, why don't you play Frankenstein? 293, you can be the bride of Frankenstein. You stand here.
Prisoner 416 was soon subjected to the harassment of Dave Eshelman, nicknamed John Wayne because of his macho attitude.
416, I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love 293.
Shut up, Frankenstein, walk.
I made the decision that I would be as intimidating, as cold, as cruel as possible.
I love you, 293.
Get up close. Get up close.
I love you, 293. I love you, 293.
You smile, 293. You get down here and do 10 push-ups.
Not even 1 weekend in the experiment, the inmates felt they were lost with reality. As on the 5th day, Zimbardo convicted a mock parole board, which was headed by one of the experiment prison consultants. Inmates who believed they deserved parole would be allowed to present their case to the board. It was during this time Zimbardo, alongside with other researchers, began to theorize that the prisoners no longer saw themselves as participants and experiments, but rather as real prisoners. According to Zimbardo's findings, the prisoners had internalized their crimes as well as their roles as inmates due to severe psychological issues caused by the abuse of guards. Ultimately led 5 students playing prisoners had to be released. At one point, Zimbardo brought a real priest to talk with the prisoners. It was during this conversation prisoner 819 who broke down crying when he was in a nearby room permitted by Zimbardo. However, the prisoners lined up chanting 819 did a bad thing over and over again, commanded by John Wayne, which ultimately led the release of 819. However, prisoner 819 didn't want to leave due to the label the prisoners had placed on him. This led to Zimbardo to intervene and reminded the student this isn't real and he's not a real prisoner.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
Eventually, 819 came back to his senses and was quickly replaced by prisoner 416, who was horrified by what he saw in the prison. He immediately staged a hunger strike in protest, but now you can tell how the guards reacted to this. They locked him up in solitary confinement. On the 5th day of the experiment, Zimbardo's girlfriend, Christiana Muslock, a recent PhD student in her professional career, was brought in to interview the prisoners. She was horrified by what she saw. She confronted Zimbardo and asked him how he could let this happen, and he lost control of the immorality of the experiment. Sometime later, Zimbardo opened his eyes and saw what he has caused. At that moment, he stated, "I had become the superintendent of the Stanford County Jail. That was who I was. I am not the researcher at all." On the 6th day, on Friday, August 20th, the study was officially cancelled, over a week earlier than intended. Zimbardo conducted a debriefing of both study groups, first all the guards, then all the prisoners, including those who had been released and had been invited to come back, and then finally meeting all together, guards and prisoners alongside each other. They were handed questionnaires. They discussed how emotionally and physical challenges they went through. They concluded that it wasn't the individual personalities of the participant, but the prison itself that shaped the outcome. This just alone shows how normal people can turn evil by circumstances. Zimbardo identified 3 different types of guards. The first was tough but fair guards who followed prison rules. The second were good guys who did little favors for the prisoners and never punished them. And finally the third, the guards who endorsed the power they held and used it to their own benefit. Zimbardo states that the last group was hostile and inventive in their own forms of prisoner embarrassment. Zimbardo concluded that most people were ultimately willing to fulfill whatever role they were given in a respective social setting. Moreover, both the ethic and conclusions of the Stanford prison experiment remain highly controversial. Scientific backings have been repeatedly questioned by other psychologists and sociologists who have been unable to duplicate its results, and even Zimbardo himself had admitted the whole thing was more of a demonstration than a scientific experiment. The significance of the Stanford prison experiment came to question once again in 2004 when a group of American soldiers were tortured and humiliated at a Iraqi prison, which was Abu Ghraib prison, and Zimbardo claimed Abu Ghraib was the Stanford prison study on steroids. Tell me, Should psychologists draw a line when it comes to subjecting participants to distress for science? This is your host, The Unknown Past. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please tell me if you want to see similar videos like this in the future. I shall see you next time.
On the first day, I said, this is not going to work. I mean, the guards felt awkward giving orders, and they'd say, okay, line up, repeat your numbers, and the prisoners start giggling.
Hey, I don't want anybody laughing. 3, 2, 1.
And then a very interesting thing happened. Dave Eshelman, who the prisoners named John Wayne, like he's a Wild West cowboy, he begins to be more extreme.
I decided that I would become the worst, most intimidating, cruel prison guard that I could possibly be.
I'll see in the future that you do work when you're told. Say it again. Say bless you, correctional officer.
I was sort of fascinated myself that people were believing the act, and I was trying to see how far I could take it before somebody would say, okay, that's enough, stop.
We did have to do things like push-ups. We would have to sing things. At the beginning, we protested some of the actions. We did things to irritate the guards.
So the guards' authority was challenged right off the bat. And the guards had to decide how they were going to handle that, and they had to decide it without our input. I mean, again, this was not a Milgram study in which we were standing over them telling them what to do. And they began to see the prisoners' behavior as a kind of an affront to their authority, and they began to push back.
We would ramp up the general harassment, just sort of crank it up a bit. Nobody was telling me I shouldn't be doing this. The professor is the authority here. You know, he's the prison warden. He's not stopping me.
This is unbelievable. They took our clothes. Hands off the door.
There was the first evening a kind of rebellion that took place.
The prisoners rebelled. They barricaded themselves in their cells and said, we refuse to come out. They took off their numbers. They didn't want to be de-individuated. They started cursing the guards to their face. And the key turning point was the guards began to think of them as...
I was told that I couldn't quit. And at that point, I felt that, well, it was really a prison. And at that point, I don't know, there's no way I can describe how I felt. I just felt totally hopeless. More hopeless than I'd ever felt before.
I didn't see where it was really harmful. It was degrading, and that was part of my particular little experiment to see how I could...
Your particular little experiment.
Yes,
why don't you tell me about that?
I was running little experiments of my own.
Tell me about your little experiments.
Okay.
I'm curious.
I wanted to see just what kind of verbal abuse that people can take before they start objecting, before they start flashing back.
If I have any regret right now, it's that, you know, I made that decision, because it would have been interesting to see what would have happened had I not decided to force things. It could be that I only accelerated them, that the same things would have happened, but we'll never know.
It surprised me that no one said anything to stop me. They just accepted what I said, and no one questioned my authority at all. And it really shocked me. Why didn't people, when I started to abuse people so much, I started to get so profane that, and still people didn't say anything.
There were a few guards who hated to see the prisoners suffer. They never did anything which would be demeaning of the prisoners. The interesting thing is none of the good guards ever intervened in the behavior of the guards who gradually became more and more sadistic over time. We like to think there is this core of human nature that good people can't do bad things, and that good people will dominate over bad situations. In fact, one way to look at the Stanford prison study is that we put good people in an evil place, and we saw who won. Well, the sad message is, in this case, the evil place won over the good people.
I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior. I was surprised, no, I was dismayed to find out that I could really be that I could act in a manner so absolutely unaccustomed to anything I would even really dream of doing. And while I was doing it, I didn't feel any regret. I didn't feel any guilt. It was only after afterwards, when I began to reflect on what I had done, that this behavior began to dawn on me, and I realized that this was a part of me I hadn't really noticed before.